Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The kingdom of Aldoria had long been ruled by monarchs who wielded both political power and immense magical abilities. For centuries, the nobles, born with magic flowing through their veins, had controlled every facet of life. But now, with the death of King Alaric and no heir to take his place, the winds of change swept through the kingdom. For the first time in its history, an election was to be held, a democratic process to decide who would take the throne. The people rejoiced at the thought of a fair and just ruler, one chosen by the voice of the many rather than the will of the few. But beneath the surface, behind the grand speeches and the banners of hope, lay a darker truth. The magic-wielding nobles, who had grown fat on power, had no intention of letting it slip through their fingers. They whispered in the shadows, plotting to manipulate the election and crown one of their own, regardless of what the people wanted. Elisa had never cared for politics. A swordswoman by trade, she had spent most of her life wandering from town to town, taking jobs where she could, and honing her skills with a blade. Her reputation as a fierce and honorable warrior had grown in recent years, but she remained a humble woman, uninterested in wealth or titles. That all changed the day she found the Sword of Fate. It was a rainy evening when Elisa stumbled upon the ancient ruins deep in the countryside. She had been traveling through the region for weeks, following whispers of unrest in the capital. Though she had no desire to get involved, the rain fell hard, turning the roads to mud, and the wind howled through the trees like a chorus of spirits. Seeking shelter, Elisa found herself at the edge of a vast, crumbling battlefield, overgrown with moss and ivy. The battlefield was said to be the site of a great war, fought long before the kingdom had ever been founded. Legend spoke of an ancient sword, hidden among the ruins, a weapon imbued with magic so powerful it could change the fate of nations. Most dismiss the tale as mere myth, a story told to frighten children. But as Elisa wandered through the ruins, something called to hear a faint hum in the air, barely perceptible above the roar of the storm. She followed the sound, her footsteps silent on the wet stone, until she reached the heart of the ruins. There, hidden beneath a fallen pillar, she saw it, a sword, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The blade was flawless, despite its age, and the hilt was encrusted with strange symbols that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. Elisa hesitated for only a moment before reaching out to touch it. As her fingers closed around the hilt, a voice echoed in her mind. "You have found me at last, Elisa of Aldoria. The time has come to reveal the truth." Elisa's heart raced, but she did not pull away. She had heard stories of magic swords, weapons of immense power that could speak to their wielders, but she had never believed them. Yet here she was, standing in the rain, holding one of those very blades. "What truth?" she whispered aloud, though no one could hear her over the storm. "The truth that will shape the future of this kingdom," the sword replied. "There is a darkness growing in the hearts of men. A great lie has been woven into the fabric of this election. You must expose it, or all will be lost." Elisa frowned. She had no interest in the politics of the capital. She was a warrior, not a politician. "I'm no one important." "Why would you choose me?" "Because you have the strength to carry this burden," the sword said simply, "and because you care for justice, even if you do not yet realize it." The sword's light flared for a moment, casting strange shadows across the ruins. Elisa felt a warmth spread through her body, a feeling of power and clarity she had never known before. This was no ordinary weapon, this was something far greater. And though she had spent her life avoiding the entanglements of the powerful, she knew that she could not turn away now. The kingdom was at a crossroads, and if what the sword said was true, then someone had to stand up and fight for what was right. Elisa sheathed the Sword of Fate at her side and set off for the capital. Aldoria's capital was a grand city, its streets paved with cobblestones and lined with towering buildings of stone and glass. The palace loomed at its center, an imposing structure of white marble, surrounded by lush gardens and high walls. It was here that the election would take place, with candidates from across the kingdom gathering to plead their cases to the people. Elisa arrived just as the campaign was beginning in earnest. The streets were filled with banners and posters, each one declaring a different candidate as the savior of the kingdom. Crowds gathered in the marketplaces to listen to speeches, while noble carriages rolled through the streets, their occupants waving and smiling as they passed. But even from a distance, Elisa could feel the tension in the air. Something was wrong here, just as the sword had warned. She made her way through the bustling city, keeping her hood low to avoid drawing attention. The sword of fate hummed softly at her side, as if sensing the corruption all around them. Elisa had no plan, no grand strategy for how to expose the lies of the nobles, but she trusted that the sword would guide her. It didn't take long for her to hear the rumors. In taverns and alleyways, people spoke in hushed tones about the election being rigged. Lord Malchus, one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, was said to be behind it all. With his mastery of illusion magic, he could create whatever reality he desired, making it seem as though he had the overwhelming support of the people, even if the truth was far different. Elisa's jaw tightened as she listened. It was worse than she had feared. Malchus wasn't just manipulating the election, he was controlling the very fabric of reality, twisting it to serve his own ends. And if no one stopped him, he would soon sit on the throne, ruling with an iron fist. She needed allies, people who could help her uncover the truth. But who could she trust in a city so filled with deceit? The sword of fate hummed louder, and she felt a tug in her mind, a sense of direction. She followed it, wending through the streets until she found herself standing before a modest house in a quiet corner of the city. The door opened before she could knock, and a man stepped out to greet her. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. His clothes were simple, but there was an air of authority about him that told Elisa he was no ordinary citizen. "You're here about Malchus," he said, his voice low but steady. "I've been expecting you." Elisa's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of her sword. "Who are you?" "My name is Tobias," the man replied, "and I'm one of the few people in this city who hasn't been bought by the nobles. I've been watching Malchus for weeks, gathering evidence of his corruption. But I can't expose him alone." "That's where you come in." Elisa eyed him warily. "And why should I trust you?" Tobias smiled faintly. "Because I have no magic, no noble title, no claim to power. All I want is a fair election, for the people to choose their ruler without fear or manipulation." "I think that's something you want too." Elisa studied him for a moment, then nodded. The sword had led her here for a reason. She would trust it, and by extension, Tobias. "All right," she said, "what's the plan?" Tobias led Elisa to a hidden room beneath the city's streets, where a small group of rebels had gathered. They were a motley crew of commoners, soldiers, even a few disillusioned mages who had grown tired of the nobles' stranglehold on power. Together, they had been working to gather proof of Malchus's schemes, but they lacked the strength to confront him directly. That was where Elisa came in. With the sword of fate, she could cut through Malchus's illusions and reveal the truth to the people. But it wouldn't be easy. Malchus was a master of deception, and his allies in the noble houses would stop at nothing to protect their own interests. Over the next few days, Elisa and the rebels worked tirelessly, uncovering more of Malchus's web of lies. They infiltrated his estate, stole documents, and recorded secret conversations. With each new piece of evidence, the picture became clearer. Malchus was planning to stage a grand illusion on the day of the election, making it appear as though he had won by a landslide, even though the real votes would tell a different story. Elisa knew that they didn't have much time. The day of the election was fast approaching, and with it, Malchus's plan to seize control of the kingdom. She could feel the weight of the sword of fate at her side, humming with a quiet intensity, as if urging her forward. The rebels had gathered enough evidence to expose Malchus's schemes, but it wasn't enough to merely show the people what he had done. They needed a public display of something undeniable, something that would shatter the illusion Malchus had carefully crafted. Tobias was tense as they gathered in a hidden room beneath the city. He had a map of the capital spread across a wooden table, its edges worn from use. Elisa stood beside him, her arms crossed, as he explained their next steps. Malchus plans to hold a rally in the central square on the morning of the election, Tobias said, pointing to a large, open space near the palace. He'll make it look like thousands are there to support him, but it'll all be an illusion. We need to get close enough to disrupt it, to reveal the truth. Elisa nodded. And how do we do that? Tobias looked at her, his expression grim. That's where the sword of fate comes in. It's the only thing that can cut through his magic. You'll need to get close enough to him during the rally, and when the time is right, use the sword to break the illusion. Elisa's grip tightened on the hilt of her sword. She had never been one for grand gestures, for public displays of power, but she knew this was the only way. If they didn't act, Malchus would take the throne, and the people would be none the wiser. We'll be there to back you up, Tobias continued. Our people would be in the crowd, ready to spread the word once the illusion breaks. But you'll have to act fast. Once Malchus realizes what's happening, he'll come after you. Elisa met Tobias's gaze. I'm ready. The morning of the election dawned bright and clear, the sun casting long shadows over the capital as the city came alive with anticipation. The streets were packed with people, all eager to witness the historic event. Banners fluttered in the breeze, and the air was thick with the hum of conversation. Elisa moved through the crowd, her hood pulled low to conceal her face. The sword of fate was strapped to her back, hidden beneath her cloak. As she made her way toward the central square, she could already see the beginnings of Malchus's illusion taking shape. The square was filled with people, too many people. Elisa had seen the turnout for the other candidates, and none of them had drawn a crowd like this. It was as if the entire city had come out to support Malchus. But she knew better. The sword of fate pulsed softly at her side, as if sensing the falsehoods all around them. Tobias had been right. Malchus was using his magic to create the illusion of overwhelming support, but in reality, most of the crowd was made up of shadows, figments conjured from his mind. The real people in the square were vastly outnumbered by these phantoms, but they didn't realize it. They were caught up in the spectacle, cheering and shouting for a man who had no intention of serving them. Elisa's heart pounded as she pushed her way through the crowd, her eyes scanning the platform at the center of the square. There, flanked by his loyal followers, stood Malchus. He was dressed in fine robes, his face a mask of confidence as he raised his hands to address the crowd. His voice boomed across the square, carried by the magic woven into the air around him. My people, Malchus began, his voice smooth and commanding, today marks the beginning of a new era. An era of strength, of unity, of power. I stand before you as a servant of the people, ready to lead this kingdom into a prosperous future. Elisa gritted her teeth. Every word that came from his mouth was a lie, carefully crafted to deceive. She glanced around the square, searching for Tobias and the others. She caught sight of them scattered throughout the crowd, their faces tense as they waited for her signal. They were ready. Taking a deep breath, Elisa stepped forward, her eyes locked on Malchus. The sword of fate hummed at her back, the energy within it building as if sensing the moment was near. She knew she had to time this perfectly. If she acted too soon, Malchus would overpower her with his magic. If she waited too long, the illusion would solidify, and they would lose any chance of exposing him. Malchus continued to speak, his voice rising as he spun his web of lies. The crowd cheered, oblivious to the truth. Elisa moved closer, her hand hovering over the hilt of her sword. She could feel the tension in the air, the magic crackling like a storm about to break. And then, in a single heartbeat, she drew the sword of fate. The blade gleamed in the sunlight, its ethereal glow cutting through the haze of magic that surrounded the square. For a moment, the crowd fell silent, their eyes drawn to the sword as if they could sense its power. And then, with a single, swift motion, Elisa slashed the air in front of her, cutting through the illusion like a knife through cloth. The effect was immediate. The air shimmered, and the phantoms that filled the square began to dissolve, their forms unraveling like smoke in the wind. The cheers of the crowd turned to gasps of confusion as they realized that the thousands of supporters they had seen were nothing more than figments of Malchus's magic. Malchus staggered on the platform, his confident facade slipping as he saw his illusion crumble. What is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp with panic. Elisa stepped forward, the sword of fate still glowing in her hand. "This is the truth, Malchus," she called out, her voice ringing across the square. "Your lies have been exposed. The people see you for what you really are." For a moment, there was silence. And then, like a wave, the murmurs of the crowd began to rise. People turned to each other, whispering, questioning. The truth was spreading, faster than Malchus could contain it. The illusion was broken, and with it, his grip on power. "No!" Malchus roared, his hands crackling with dark energy as he prepared to strike. "You will not take this from me." Elisa braced herself, gripping the sword of fate tightly as Malchus unleashed his magic. Dark tendrils of energy shot toward her, but the sword flared with light, deflecting the attack. She could feel the weight of the magic pressing down on her, but she stood firm, her eyes locked on Malchus. "This ends now," she said, her voice steady. With a final surge of power, Elisa charged toward the platform. Malchus tried to conjure another illusion, but the sword of fate cut through it with ease. She reached him in a heartbeat, the sword glowing brighter than ever as she raised it high. Malchus raised his hands in a desperate attempt to defend himself, but it was too late. With one swift strike, Elisa brought the sword of fate down, the blade slicing through the air with a deafening hum. The energy that had surrounded Malchus shattered, and he fell to his knees, his power broken. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Elisa stood over the fallen noble. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was plain for all to see. Malchus had tried to steal the election through deceit and manipulation, but he had been defeated by the power of justice and truth. As the realization swept through the square, the people began to cheer not for Malchus, but for Elisa, the swordswoman who had saved them from a future of lies. Tobias and the rebels moved through the crowd, spreading the truth of what had happened. The election, once teetering on the edge of corruption, was now free and fair. Elisa lowered the sword of fate, the glow fading as the magic within it settled. She looked down at Malchus, who lay crumpled at her feet, his once great power reduced to nothing. "You will answer for your crimes," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of finality. The city guards, who had been standing by, unsure of what to do, finally moved in to take Malchus into custody. The crowd parted as they led him away, the cheers of the people echoing in his ears. Elisa sheathed the sword of fate and turned to Tobias, who had come to stand beside her. His face was filled with gratitude, but there was something else there too, a recognition of what they had just accomplished. "You did it," Tobias said, his voice filled with awe. Elisa shook her head. "We did it. All of us." Together, they stood in the heart of the city, watching as the people of all Doria celebrated their first true election. The kingdom had been saved, not by magic or power, but by the truth. And as Elisa looked out over the cheering crowd, she knew that this was only the beginning. The sword of fate had done its work, but its journey was far from over.